the kind invitation to be here, and also thank you for all to be here as well. Let me see if I can share my screen. Yes, great. Okay. Okay, fantastic. So this is so much work in progress that the title has, I substituted development for structural transformation. So we're going to go back and forth. This is joint work with Pedro Américo, who's also here. So he can also help me answer the questions that you might have. And it's work in progress. Actually, we'll start to present this paper around. So it would be great to have feedback as we go. So what is the paper about? So let me start kind of with a motivation for what we're doing here. So there's a pretty large literature, very large, going both from kind of macro growth accounting and also recently in trying to incorporate also micro data into it, that establishes human capital as a fundamental driver of structural transformation in the 20th century. Countries that started with higher levels of schooling were countries where, when technology was around, both in terms of like industrial revolution, but later also for developing countries, those countries were able to industrialize faster. They adopted more modern technologies, adopted those technologies faster, and over the long run, those countries grow more, and those are countries that today have higher income. Right, so it's not a coincidence that if you look in the cross section, both across countries, but also within regions and within countries, places that have higher schooling are places that on average income per capita is larger. And that has been established both for the case of the US, but also for going back in history, and also lots of work of Galore as well. Now, the interesting thing, if you think about how important education of human capital has been in terms of generating structural transformation and economic development, is that some countries and regions expanded mass public schooling fast and early, while others really fell behind. So there's a huge variation if you look across countries and across regions as well, like these variations in the Americas, but for example, if you look at like sub-Saharan Africa, you have like huge variations as well. If you go to Asia, you also have a lot of variation. So the two questions here, right? One is, why did it help that some countries, for example, invested and expanded mass schooling while others did not? That's like question number one. And then question number two is, what are the consequences of that? And whether that matters in the long run, whether those things persisted in the long run or not. For the case of the Americas, there's a lot of very nice historical work done by Mariscal and Sokolov, among others, documenting like this difference across different countries. Now, the answer to the question of why some countries expanded faster and others did not, a lot of the previous work, they'll link it to inequality, and especially like land inequality. And that's kind of like the influential work of Engelman and Sokolov, for example, in 2000, for those of you that are familiar, trying to explain the different developments, for example, in the Americas, if you compare the North, like US, Canada, compared to, for example, Latin America. But it's not only Engelman and Sokolov, ideas were there from Cotsworth, if you look at like Nugent and Robinson and more. So the basically three type of ideas out there of why like inequality can be linked to like the expansion of schooling. One has to do with like extension of the franchise, right? This idea that a lot of investments in public goods, they changed when you gave the right to vote to people that were like relatively poor. You changed the median voter, and then the governments reacted to that, right? So there's evidence on that going back to like England, but also evidence from a lot of other countries, including Europe, etc. Now, that's fine, but because in general, extension of the franchise is the same for like the whole country, that cannot explain patterns of, for example, relative investment, right? Why is it the case that in some locations within a country or regions. One country invests a lot in education and the other region did not. So the second idea has to do with political economy incentives, right? And political economy incentives here can be kind of two types. One has to do with like identity of the elites. And this go back to a point that the Galore and Crowthers make in the paper, where depending on the relative incentives of landowners versus industrialists, then you'd have the incentive, the elite will have the incentive to provide education, right? So the idea being that landowners at that time, think about like late 19th century, early 20th century, because there was not a lot of technology involved in agriculture, then in order to increase productivity in agriculture, you don't have to have an educated labor force. Where if you think about like manufacturing taking off, then you needed more skilled workers, and therefore you might have incentives to invest in education, right? So this idea that depending on the identity of the elites, you might have incentives to invest in education. And then there's like an additional component to kind of the political economy component of this, which is this idea that depending on the political institutions of a country, like I'm going to be talking here about Brazil. So, and what I'm going to say about Brazil is actually common in many countries where you needed to be literate to vote, and therefore increasing literacy and investing in education meant bringing new voters into the political game, right? So if you wanted to maintain your political power and not diffuse the possibility of people to vote, then there was an incentive to not give education to everybody. This is not a new argument, but it's an argument that was formalized, for example, in a paper by Francois Bourguignon and Thierry Verdier, okay? So this is kind of a little bit of the motivation. So specifically what we're gonna do in the paper is we're gonna look at a measure of political power of elites in the beginning of the 20th century in Brazil. And what we're going to do that's a little bit different from what's out there in the literature is that we're going to establish, based on new data, a new measure of political power. So a lot of this literature tried to link inequality to investments in education and kind of long-run development. A lot of it is measuring land inequality, right? So people go from like, okay, I have a measure of land inequality here. Let's see like the long-term effects of that. But land inequality can be capturing a lot of things, right? So what we want to do is we want a specific measure of who has the power and how unequal this power was distributed. So what we do is that we digitize a new data set where we have the occupational structure of the voting elite in São Paulo in 1905. So in the beginning of the 20th century. And the occupation on who voted is important because by the time you could only vote if you were a man, literate, and at least 21 years old, which meant that for the state of São Paulo, which at the time, and still is, the largest and in terms of population and the richest state in Brazil, we're talking about only 3.5% of the population of the state were eligible to vote, okay? By the way, let me make a small parenthesis here that maybe it's not important for the paper, but it's important from the context as a whole. This restriction on literate to vote in Brazil goes all the way until 1985. So I think if I remember correctly, Brazil was, if it was not the last one, was among the last countries in the world to actually abolish literacy requirements to vote, okay? So we're talking about a very small number of people voting at that time, which means that if out of those 3.5%, the occupation, who are these people in terms of like their economic identity could matter a lot because those were the elites that were making the decisions. So what we're going to do is that we're going to measure at the municipal level using this occupational structure of who voted, whether this is mostly what we call agrarian elite, that is voters related to agriculture, or like say industrialist elites or religious elites, whatever it is. Our focus here is really going to be on the agrarian elites. And what we're interested on is linking this composition of the voters in the beginning of the 20th century to investments in mass education that were made both in the beginning of the 20th century, but then we're going to measure over time whether those investments in education persisted among places where you have more of this agrarian elite voting vis-a-vis less of the agrarian elite voting. And we're going to try to link, yes.
There is a question. Would you like to take it now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Mamiki, please. You have to unmute yourself. Okay, you can, okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
No question. Apologies. Sorry, my mouse just.
Okay, okay, sorry. Okay, no problem. Claudio, please go ahead.
No problem. Yeah, so I was saying that we're going to link. So we're going to first establish the relationship between the political power of these agrarian elites across different localities. Then we're going to link it to investments in mass education. We're going to test whether those investments persisted over time. And then we're going to try to document whether it affected the structural transformation in the state of São Paulo in Brazil and long-term development. Okay, so the results are going to be in two pieces. First, I'm going to document the short-run relationship between investments in education and the composition of voters. Then we're going to ask ourselves, okay, does this matter for like structural transformation? And then we're going to document like this persistence over time. Okay, so that's the plan. Now, without spending too much time on the literature, there's a lot of related work here. So let me just cite a couple of things that I think is important. So like I was saying before, this is quite close to the work of Oded Galor, Moav, and this one only Oded Galor and Moav, and the other with Vorath in 2009. Of course, the classical work of like Lindert and Go, etc. Now, this evidence is kind of mixed in the sense that there are two things here, right? So both the fact that when Galor et al., for example, they talk about the importance of agricultural elite vis-a-vis industrial elite, they really link it back to like land inequality, right? So there's no political measure in the work that they did. And then there's a big question mark here on whether these things really persisted over time or not. There's a separate literature which is related, which is this idea that who is in power really matter for modernization, more related to, for example, the Industrial Revolution. And then finally, this work is also related to this idea that persistence in human capital, policies that affect human capital can have like large persistence over time, right? So this goes back to like Hillary, some work that we have done for the case of Brazil with Rudi Rocha and Soares, the work that my colleague here at UBC, Felipe Valencia Caicedo, did for the case of like cultural persistence and education. But a lot of people have documented that investments in education sometimes persisted for 50 to 100 years. They don't disappear very fast. So differential policies in human capital can have very large persistence, okay? All right. So just to make sure, as I move along the results, you keep an eye on what's the contribution of the paper. And the way we view the contribution of the paper is first, a different measure of the identity of the voting elite that other papers, most of them don't do. The Goni paper here is an exception for the case of the England, where he links the actually using biographical data on who were the MPs that were voting, right? And what type of elite they were coming from. He links that identity to decisions of education, but different from what we do, he only looks at like short run effects. He's only interested in understanding kind of whether the identity of the elite at the time affected education, while we interested in going beyond the short run effect and really understanding whether education could have contributed to structural transformation for several decades. Okay, that's the main contribution of the paper. Okay, so let me start giving a quick institutional background that you need to know on Brazil. It's going to be very quick. I won't go super in detail. So it's going to be just the basic history that you need to understand the paper. Then I'll move to describe the data and present the results. Okay, so Brazil moved from a monarchy constitution in 1824, where there was a restriction on the right to vote that was based on income. And the restriction to vote based on income, and this was vote to elect representatives, although it was a monarchy, but most of the people couldn't vote because you had a minimum income that you needed to have in order to become a voter. When the Republic was established in Brazil, a new constitution came to place in 1891, and it took away this voting restriction based on income, but it kept the restriction based on literacy. And because at the time, the population of Brazil, the level of literacy was very, very small, in the end, it was almost indifferent, because the only thing that it did is that it now allowed people that were literate, but for some reason didn't have like enough income to vote before, now to vote. But in terms of like the size of the electorate, it didn't change a lot. So voting was still restricted to literacy. Very small share of people voted. The second thing that this constitution did, which is kind of important for the paper, is that it decentralized the responsibility of education to the states, mainly to the states, and later the states decentralized some of their responsibility to more local level kind of municipality. But this is important because then the education level of the state was closely linked to your capacity to collect taxes. And there is some work by Aldo Musacchio and co-authors, for example, establishing that. Okay. The second thing that's important here is that the main agricultural production of Brazil, and mainly São Paulo at the time, was coffee, very linked to land inequality. There was like a huge land inequality, and oligarchic elites that were like controlling this type of production have a lot of political power and a lot of the say. Okay, so the novelty here, like I was saying, is building a new data set. This is what we're going to do. And what we do is we discover a thing called the map of the electorate, which provides us for 1905. You can see here a list of municipalities as you go down. So each one of these is a municipality in the state of São Paulo. And then you have here the number of voters. And then what we have here, profissões mean occupation. So you can see that you have all the occupations: artists, agriculturalists, retailers, industrialists, etc. So what we're gonna do, and this is kind of pretty unique, it's very hard to have a sense of like the declared occupation at the time, right? So what we're gonna do is gonna use this to build a measure of, first, the share of agriculture out of total number of workers, what share were coming from agriculture or industry, etc. So this is like the first measure that we're gonna build, and this is gonna be the main measure that we're going to try to estimate the effect on schooling and persistence of schooling and structural transformation over time. But it's also going to be important, for example, to account for the relative size of the electorate, right? Because it might be that because there are differences in initial literacy, it might be that in some places more people can vote and in other places less people can vote. So we're going to also build a measure of voters in the total population. And finally, we're also going to build a measure of the concentration of dispersion of different occupations across different voters, right? Because it might be that, for example, in one municipality, the agricultural voters are, say, 80% of the total voters, while in other municipalities is split across different occupations. All right. So this is a first look at the data, just so you have a sense on how it looks. So this is the share of voters over the total population, and this is like a histogram for São Paulo as a whole. Remember that I told you in the beginning that the average is more or less 3.5%, right? So you can see that on average, I mean, you have some places where 8% of the population voted, but on average, around a bunch of the data is like between, say, 2 to 4% of the population that they are voting. So a very, very small share of people could actually vote. And here on the right, what I have is the share of voters that were farmers, right? I mean, of course, there might be mistakes on this. This is self-declared. It's actually not self-declared. This is based on when you went to register that you want to become a voter, they will ask, what's your occupation, right? And then you have, I mean, a lot of variation, but on average, something around like 60%, which corresponds to the economy of the time, but also correspond to how the elite was distributed.
But Claudio,
Yes.
do you actually know whether they were the landowner or the person just working in a farm? Can you distinguish?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Manuel. Thank you. We don't actually, right? So what we're doing here is that we are assuming, because the level of education at the time was so low, right? We are assuming that most of the work, we're not assuming, I mean, that's in the data, but most of the workers in farms, they were illiterate, right? So it was very, I would say, unique for you to be literate and working in the farm and not being like the owner of the farm. So most of these people would be the owners of the farm, but no, we don't have data to show that, unfortunately. Even in this old census, it's very hard to cross this type of like information, right? So yeah, so that's an assumption that we're making. So we're assuming that if they declare that they are farmers, is because most of the times they'll be the owners of the land.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we're gonna have a cross section covering 161 municipalities in the state of São Paulo between 1905 and 2010. We're going to have both education income data that is going to come from the censuses. So we're going to have censuses between 1920, 2010. We're also going to have a historical census going back to late 19th century that we're also going to use. We're also going to have some statistical yearbooks for the state of São Paulo. And we're going to do two things, as I'm going to explain later, right? We're going to merge the data set to match the 1905 boundaries of the municipalities to link like this data. And we're going to do two analyses. One is going to be a cross-section and the other is going to be kind of more panel data. I will explain in a second why we're doing both things. It's going to become clear. But before telling you like what's actually the estimation, the equation that we're gonna estimate, so just so you have a sense of the variation that we have, this is the measure of farmers that were voters. This is the measure of like literacy rate in 1920, right? So you can see that if you look at this map, there seem to be like some correlation. It's not like it's not the correlation, but in terms of like the darker it is here, right? So the more farmer voters you tend to see, if you look at the map, the lighter you tend to see it here, in the sense that like this seems to be less education in places where you have darker and more farmer votes, if you look at like the right and the left. So this is the state of São Paulo. You can see that also, second thing that's important here in more geography is that this is kind of like the new frontiers, like super large municipalities. So a lot of the variation is coming from like the center, not this like huge area here, which was kind of the frontier at the time. Okay, so in terms of empirical strategy, we're going to do two things. The first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to estimate a series of cross-section regressions where we're going to regress measures of education, like literacy, for example. We're going to start in 1920, and we're going to regress that against the measure of agricultural power in 1905, or like agrarian elite. We're going to control for the number of voters in relative to the total population, because that's going to be important. And then the name of the game here is going to be, let me control for as many things that we might be worried about that could affect kind of like literacy rates, right? And also maybe could affect why I see variation in agricultural power of elites in some place versus the other, right? So this is going to be characteristics based on geography, baseline socioeconomic characteristics based on like previous census, infrastructure. So everything that we have in terms of data is going to be in this X vector inside this equation. And here we're using the 1920 geographical boundaries. And we're going to run a bunch of cross sections starting in 1920, going like all the way to 2010, allowing us like to see how this coefficients like evolve over time. Okay. The second analysis is we actually going to stack the data one on top of the other. The reason why we do two analyses is that once you stack the data on top of the other, because municipalities change a lot over time, then you have to go back and map everything to the original boundaries, right? So I'm going back and I'm mapping everything back to the 1872 boundary, which means that I end up with like way less observations over time, but then I can track over time and include the municipality fixed effect in this regression that can account for like basic non-observable characteristics, and then plot kind of an event study graph that I'm going to show you, trying to suggest that before 1920, the evolution of educational trends, for example, are more or less similar between places with more and less agricultural power. And it's really after 1891, when you have this both change in the constitution that you decentralize education to the states, and you have this change in who can vote, that you start observing these different patterns. Okay, so I'll show you first a table of the cross section, and then I'll show you like the results on the panel data as well. So let me just pause here, see if there are like any questions in terms of the methods and what we're estimating and things like that.
Claudio, there is a question. Koketsu, I'm allowing you to talk. You have to unmute yourself. And so before Koketsu came, Claudio, was thinking, do you actually know the size of those farms? If it was a large farm or a small farmer, how was the structure? The question is, how was the structure of the agricultural sector in the state of São Paulo back in 1905?
Yeah, it was very unequal, right? So there's a huge inequality. Usually farms are large, and there's a lot of like concentration. And this is going to be important because if you talk about the effects of agricultural power, then one confounder in this regression here could be like, oh, all you're picking up is really kind of like land inequality, right? So we're going to measure using the census data land inequality, and we're going to throw that in the regressions and show that the results don't change, and most of the effects are not coming from difference in land inequality. Now, ideally, I guess, Manuel, what you have in mind is that, of course, ideally, it would be really cool if you can measure the size of the farm of the people that are voting, right? That we cannot do, that we don't know. So we cannot merge data sets where we know for those voters, are they really big landowners, right? That we cannot know.
Okay, thanks. Koketsu, do you still have a question, or can we continue? Okay, let's, Claudio, please go ahead.
Okay, all right, so So let me then start showing the results. First, let me show you the result in the graph. So this is a graph where we control for some characteristics. And I'm showing you the relationship between literacy rate in 1920, and voters that were farmers in 1905, right? So what this relation is telling us is like in places where the people that vote were not majority farmers, in those places you observe literacy rates around like 40%, but in places where mostly farmers were the ones voting, between say 70, 80%, you observe literacy rates around 20, for example, right? Between 20 and 30. So this is 15 years after we're measuring the share of farmers, right? I'm showing you the result for the 1920 census. So let me show you this in a more systematic way, showing the regression. So here the dependent variable is literacy in 1920, regress against share of farmers. Column 1 doesn't control for anything. Column 2 controls, as I said before, for the share of voters. And then as we move to the right, then we control for all the things that we discussed, including, Manuel, here was your question, land inequality, right? It's also important here to look at, like, for example, the transportation infrastructure, as this is a period where like railways were expanding. Here we control for pre-existing characteristics on the previous censuses in terms of like education and the previous like yearly books from Sao Paulo. And finally here, for example, you might be worried about like some places had more slaves before than others. Before you abolish slavery in Brazil, that might be correlative, like the structure of farmers and also education. So in this last column, we compare to characteristics from the 1872 census, which includes, for example, slavery. But you can see that the coefficient is pretty robust, even like as you control for like a lot of stuff, even though we only have 161 observations, you have a pretty robust coefficient. In terms of the magnitude, what this coefficient is telling us is that if you change the share of farmers voters by 1 standard deviation, you reduce literacy in 6.11 percentage points, which is something around 22%. So it's a sizable effect. There's a very close connection and a sizable effect in terms of the association between literacy rate and the identity of the farmers, of the voters in terms of the farmers in those places. Now, there are tons of other hypotheses that could link inequality to literacy rate. So what we do next is show that some of those hypotheses or alternative channels don't seem to be there. So for example, when you try to see how mechanized or not the farms were, for example, you don't find a relationship between mechanization and the political power of farmers in those places. We don't find an effect with like wages. It's not that like there is an endogenous entry of like infrastructure based on that. This is coffee productivity. He is just trying to pick up whether there is any association with like agricultural productivity. So it doesn't seem that some of these alternative channels that are there in the literature are the ones that explain why you have more or less investment in education and why you're going to see that persistence over time. Now, one big alternative story here has to do with, well, maybe it's not about the identity of the elite that's voting. So maybe this is not about the fact that locally this place is dominated by voters that are farmers and they're representing the agricultural elite interests. Maybe it's all about political concentration, right? Maybe in places that you have a lot of farmers, it's just that a lot of the power is concentrated in the hands of those things, those people. So one thing that you can do to test that is create a measure of political concentration, right? So this is like, you pick the share of voters of different occupations and you estimate and you calculate Herfindahl index, for example, and then you use that in this regression, but we don't find that political concentration per se, either alone or interacted with the share of farmer voters, have any explanatory power in terms of literacy rates. Okay.
Claudio, there is a question from Lucas. Where do elite farmers vote? Where they live or where the field is located?
So all our analysis is done at the municipality, right? So the idea here is that you're going to be a farmer in a municipality, you own land in the municipality, you want to have a say here, and you want to influence politics, right? Of course, it might be that if you're looking at, like, for example, in 1905, there might be like one very big landowner, very rich, for example, that he might live in the capital and have all his farms in a location. But during this time, as far as I understand, reading some of the history, that was not that common. I think that's something common more like as you move in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, as São Paulo becomes a more industrialized and richer place, then that becomes more common. Okay. So now let me move into the big part of the paper, I think, in terms of like differentiating with the rest of the literature, which is actually showing the persistence. So one way to show the persistence, maybe the first way to show the persistence, is split municipalities between places where the agrarian elite had low political power and places where the agrarian elite had a lot of political power. So this is just kind of separating above and below the median, right? And you can see that if you look at like the 1872 and the 1890 census, the literacy rate in those places, it looks kind of similar and trends in a similar way. And it's only in the next census in 1920, remember that I told you that 1891 is the new constitution that generates the decentralization of education to the more local level. And it's only between 1890 and 1920 that you see this difference in opening up. And what we observe is that basically literacy rates evolve in a differential way. In places where you had low agrarian political power, those places literacy rate improve in a much faster pace compared to places where the agrarian elite had a lot of power. Those places kind of lag behind, at least up until 1950. And then you see that starting in 1950, then they start to converge, but it takes a long time for them to converge back. Even if you look today in the 2010 census, there's still a little bit of a difference between those places. Although, of course, in 1991, you close most of the gap. But I mean, it takes a long time. You're talking about 40, 50, 60 years where the education in those places stayed very different. Now, one way to make sure that this difference is there once you use the continuous variable is just to estimate the effect of literacy on the variable that we're interested on, controlling for a lot of things. So this point estimate here is telling us what's the effect in 1920, 1940, as we move along on time. This is like a bunch of cross sections for 1920, 1940, 1950. And then you see, like I said before, that's only 1960 that we see the convergence occurring. Another way to do that is to estimate it with the panel data, right? So this is the coefficient estimated with the panel data going back to 1872 and then stacking observations one on the top of each other. These coefficients here are normalized such that we're normalizing the coefficient here in 1890. Okay, so you see this significant decline in literacy rates in places where the agrarian elite had more power, when you see the convergence back starting the 50s and 60s, taking a long time up until the 1980s. Okay, what are the consequences of this? So one of the reasons I told you in the beginning that we're interested on this is that not only want to understand whether differential political power of agrarian elites in a point where education was not important for them, and they wanted to block entry of new agents that could get political power, we not only want to document that like persisted over time, but we want to document whether once Brazil starts industrializing, in like the earliest 1920s, 30s, 40s, once Brazil starts to industrialize, whether this is an issue that affects structural transformation. So what we're doing here in these figures is running similar regressions when we look as a dependent variable on the composition of employment in agriculture, manufacturing, and service, and we regress that against that measure of political power of the agricultural elites. So what we find? What we find is that employment in agriculture, as you would expect, is larger in places where the agricultural elite had more voting power or voting voice, and that's true up until the 1960s, which means that during a long time, even as Brazil starts to industrialize, like in 30s and the 40s, right? So this is the point of industrialization. It is still the case that those places that start with a more agrarian elite and less education, they industrialize much slower. And not only they industrialize much slower in terms of like agriculture to manufacturing, but they also are much slower in catching up with the service economy as well, right? So overall, in those places where the agrarian elite had more power to begin with, you have lower literacy rates, and once modernization in terms of manufacturing services kick in, those places lag behind at least until the 1970s. So this is like, I don't know, 50 years of lagging behind. So we have a lot of other results in the paper, but let me focus on showing you kind of like a couple of tables just on the mechanisms and why we observe these places lagging behind. Like what observes, what explains the literacy rates lagging behind. So we can show using data for the census that definitely for sure you have lower complete elementary and middle school using like census data over time. So not only in terms of looking at the literacy, but you also see on the top of the distribution in terms of people completing elementary and middle school, you have like less people in places where farmers had more political power. You also can look at the census data to see whether you really had less people attending school, and you did. You see that this result only disappears kind of like around the 1990s, but all the way until like the 1980s, and especially so until the 1970s, you have less kids attending school in places where originally you have the agricultural elite having more power to begin with.
Claudio, Claudio, there is a question from Saisha. Would you like to take it now?
So let me take like 3 minutes to finish, and then we can like open up for questions.
Okay, Saisha, you come. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so the other things that we try to see is like inputs in terms of education. So we show that 1920, 1960, the effect disappears around like 1970, 80, whatever. But you see that like in those places, there are like less teachers per schools, less schools per young age. And finally, what we document that's striking in some sense is that even until today, if you look at like data in 2010 and 2000, it's still the case that in the top of the distribution of schooling, for example, share of people with like a high school degree or people like with college, you see that even until today, there seem to be like some difference in education that you can see, for example, once you look at like, sorry, let me show you one. Here. You look at like education inputs, for example, if you look at like university professors and other things, you still see some difference in education, even persisting until today. Although, like I said, a lot of it like disappeared over time, but it took many, many years for the convergence to occur. So let me stop there, and then we can open up for questions. But let me take 30 seconds just to summarize what we found, what the paper is about, right? So what we're interested on is trying to understand, is there a way that the identity of the elites in the beginning of the 20th century could have generated any type of differential effect in terms of who was in power, mapping into education. We find this very strong relationship in like 1920, very strong, that is like very, very robust. And then we document how the fact that this differential elite identity could have affected like structural transformation over time in Brazil, industrialization, adoption of like retail services, etc. And we showed that it did and had like a massive effect in terms of making a lot of these economies still like being intensive in agriculture for like a long time. And it took a long time like to converge, right? We saw that even until today, you still find a little bit like of difference across those places. So let me stop there and then we can like open up for questions and comments.
Okay, thanks, Claudio. Saisha, I will allow you to talk, and then you unmute yourself and go ahead. Okay, before Saisha comes, there is a question here, Claudio, from Anthony. Would the usual process of development from agriculture to manufacturing to services not be a factor in correctly interpreting the data?
Say it again, Manuel, sorry.
Would the usual process of development from agriculture to manufacturing to services not be a factor in correctly interpreting the data?
Yeah, so there is a natural process, right? So industrialization and modernization is taking place in the country in Brazil, like it is taking place in other places, right? So there are many other things that, of course, affect industrialization, including my co-author here, Pedro Américo, has some work looking at railways, for example, and how reductions in transportation costs affect industrialization. What we're saying here is, on top of all these other factors, one factor that seemed to have played a very important role, as people have already documented, is how educated the population was. And what we're linking that education was not something that comes from heaven, it's something that the local elites are deciding in order to do, right? So what we're saying is like the differential power of agrarian elite retarded some of those places exactly because they decided to invest less in education than others.
Question and answer. So there's a question from Lian. What happened in 1950? A bit of background. So I guess 1950 is sort of redemocratization in Brazil, right, Claudio? That's why there is a sort of break.
Yeah, so Brazil had a dictatorship between 1930 and 1945. So there's like kind of this first push of industrialization in Brazil. A lot of people say that happened exactly during Getúlio Vargas, which was the dictatorship. They had a lot of specific policies. And then there's like a second round of policies that starting 1950, 1960. And then especially like once a new dictatorship comes in 1964, there's also a big push for industrialization through kind of an import substitution strategy. So there's a lot of up and downs, like in terms of like democracy and the history, but I don't know if like something specifically happened in 1950 that's not kind of like this trend.
Okay, Saisha, would you like to ask your question now, or I'm also allow Jessica to ask? Jessica, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Claudio. That's a really nice work. I really enjoyed listening to it. I was, I mean, just like an observation, you see like this convergence in literacy, like with time. I was just wondering if maybe the quality of education is still different in those places. As you show, like I think in your last slides, educational provision seems to be still like there's some difference. So I was wondering maybe you could use Prova Brasil to check like whether students are more or less proficient in those different places. But yeah, it's really nice work. I really enjoyed.
Yeah, definitely, for sure, we can do that. We can definitely try to look at whether. Yeah, I think there is kind of like an existential debate in this paper, in the sense that like if you really let me see if I can go to the if you look at, for example, like years of schooling like today, right? although the coefficients are statistically significant, in terms of the magnitude, is really tiny, right? So what happens basically, these places converge. I mean, it took a long time and they were lagged behind, but eventually they converge. So it's this effect, although it's here, is not massive. The effects really appear more in the top of the distribution still, right? So when you go to college, so I'm not sure if we look at, like, for example, Prova Brasil, which is quality of education at whatever, when kids are like 15, 16, I'm not sure something is going to emerge. We could definitely look at it. It would be interesting to see whether this persisted. But my guess would be more maybe on the top of the distribution of education, more like maybe in college or something like that. But we could definitely, thanks, Jessica, we could definitely do that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Lucas, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Claudio, for this fantastic presentation. Let me ask first a clarification question. If the responsibility to conduct education has been decentralized at the state level, wouldn't it be ideal to compare states in Brazil instead of just looking at municipalities within the state of Sao Paulo? And my second question, coming from the south, from Argentina, in our case, I have not studied this subject as you are doing, but in our case, my sensation is that in the case of Argentina, actually the landed elite was when they were in power, they were the ones who expanded mass education in Argentina, but they usually expanded mass education in the place where they live, which was downtown Buenos Aires or downtown large cities, instead of the places where they had their fields. So that's the reason I was asking you about whether you know if the farmer is voting in the place he lives, which could be in downtown Sao Paulo, where might be the richest part of the city, or if he's voting in the place where his field is located. Thank you, Claudio.
Yeah, no, thank you, Lucas. Those are fantastic points. I mean, on your last point, Sebastián Galliani has a paper exactly on that, right? So probably, I don't know if that's why you had it in mind, but Galliani and co-authors, they have this paper where they try to explain the expansion of education in the elite, because exactly what you're saying, right? Because they live in Buenos Aires, they had demand for services, right? And the qualified, educated people will provide them with better service. So they have this model where they explain the expansion because of the demand for higher quality services, right? So this is not happening in Brazil for two reasons, I think. One is because relative to Argentina, as you well know, Brazil was much poorer, right? So Argentina during this period of time, in relative sense, was a rich country compared to all of us. So I think there are 2 points here, right? One was demand for education was higher just because people were richer in relative sense. But then I think also because of a lot of the economic activity in Argentina was already had this demand-driven effect from services, that's where it comes there. So I think those are great points. Unfortunately, we have a lot of problems with data. So the reason why you're right in the sense that, for example, the paper that Aldo Musacchio does, he does it at the state level, and he links the expansion of education to commodity booms, right? This idea that if you have like a boom, for example, in the price of coffee, then because it was decentralized to state, now São Paulo have a lot of money. So São Paulo could expand more the education than, say, Rio de Janeiro or Minas Gerais, for example. That's exactly what he shows in his paper. But if you look at like historians, a lot of historians that study education in Brazil will say like that was true, but compared to what they could have expanded education based on the amount of money they were spending, that's a point that, for example, Colistete makes in a couple of papers that he had, they were investing very little, right? So if you look at, for example, in terms of the budget, the revenue that they had, and even I think you compare to Argentina, I think like Sokolov and co-authors have some comparisons along those lines, was relatively small, right? So they're still not expanding a lot compared to what they could expand. But in practice, the reason why we don't do it for other states is just because we don't have the identity of the voters for the other states. If we had it, then we can expand and do it for the whole Brazil.
Okay, thanks. Saisha, okay, Saisha, when you would like to ask your question, you can come in.
Great to see you, Lucas, here, by the way.
Same, Claudio.
So, Claudio, there is a question from Anthony. If agriculture dominated the economy in those early days, is it possible that successful farmers may have contributed to rising literacy rates wherever the produce was sold, possibly only in the locality? Do they study account of subsequent rising literacy rates as the earlier agricultural output grows? I think it's related to our previous question.
Yeah, so I think the way that I interpret, I'm not a historian, right? So a lot of what I'm saying here is based on my interpretation of what I've read of historians. But I think at the time, it was the type of agriculture that most of the state of São Paulo was doing, which is really coffee, is very low in skills, right? You didn't need a lot of skills. You just need like a lot of people to pick coffee up in the fields. So there are not a lot of incentives to expand education. The more high skill education in agriculture is happening, and I have another paper that looks at this, is exactly through migration. So the migration that comes where people wanted to migrate to Brazil to have their own pieces of land and be agriculture entrepreneurs. A lot of them were coming from Germany, Russia, Italy, etc. And in the state of São Paulo, there were colonial settlements where the state was providing people with the land that you could pay back to the state. So I have a paper in the AJ published in 2017 who looks exactly at that. That generated education because those more skilled people that were migrating, they already arrived with more education and more skills, right? And that generated more education over time. So there's this clear distinction between what the elite had wanted for the overall population and the push for like migrants that were more educated, right? And in fact, I mean, one thing that we do, let me see if I find this table here somewhere. Maybe I don't have it. Yes, here. One thing that we do, for example, is exactly because there was this push for foreigners pushing for education, right? Then we control for that in the equation. And you can see that, for example, our share of farmers is negatively correlated with literacy rates in 1920. But you control for the share of foreigners, it's positive and significant. I mean, the effect stays the same as if you don't control for it, because it's just a completely different process, right? But it's highly correlated, like we have shown in this other work, right? But that's a separate mechanism that's going on there.
So, Claudio, just an observation, given that Brazil was receiving a lot of immigrants at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, is it also possible that there was this story of the time that particular groups have been in Brazil? For instance, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they have been there for much longer than the Italians and the Germans. Do you think there is anything that can be done about that to count the number?
Yeah, we have some of those results in this paper, in the AJ paper with Rodrigo Rocha and Rodrigo Soares. So with Rudi and Rodrigo, we did some of that looking at like nationalities. And basically we showed that like a lot of the positive effects were coming from countries that more skilled people were migrating. Like, for example, in relative sense, the Italians arriving in Brazil in the colonial settlements were more educated than the Portuguese, for example, and then generated like the demand for them to establish like schools in rural areas for their kids that the Portuguese, for example, they didn't do the same. Same thing for Germans, for example, right? They were arriving, they were way more educated than like say Spanish and Portuguese at the time.
And there is a question from Calvin. Could it be the fact that areas dominated by agricultural activities, people do not value education so much as there are alternative activities to survive on?
I mean, so it could, in the sense that, again, education is like a supply and demand, right? So one of the big stories, like I was saying to Lucas, right, in the case of Argentina, is that part of the relative success story of Argentina compared to Brazil in education was not only supply driven, but it was also demand driven. As people becoming richer, they demanded more education, right? And the government responded. So, I mean, it could be that part of the story here is well, you don't have the demand because you're poor, but we're controlling for all those things, right? I mean, you can control for a lot of these things in the regression. And one thing that you can do is, for example, control for, like we're doing this regression here, for the share of workers in agriculture to begin with, or like some proxies of income and all that, right? But the political effect that we think we're capturing in terms of like the interest of the elite and the identity of the elite survives all this type of control. So I think on top of all this demand story, there's a political economy supply story here that explains the patterns.
Okay, let me ask if there are more questions or comments from the participants. From my side, also, although you have this electoral variable there, but as we know, also Brazil in the 20th century had the moments of more democracy and moments of less democracy until 1985, right? Is there any way of capturing a positive trend, for instance, because we know there is a parallel literature suggesting that democracy determines education? That you go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're actually trying to collect some data, Pedro and I, of like some proxy for like voting over time, political competition. Is tricky, but São Paulo, surprisingly enough, is not the best state to have this type of electoral data. I have another work, for example, that I have it from Minas Gerais and Ceará, that's like fantastic for other states. But we are trying to collect some data in between that we can look at some of that, like share of voters, level of political competition at the local level. Another thing that people talk a lot about in the history is the entry of immigrants into politics, which is something that's hard to capture here. But like over time, a lot of people say that the entry of immigrant into politics in some localities in São Paulo, for example, generated completely different public goods, right? So if you now have like an Italian descendant mayor that thinks that education is important, whatever, and thinks that manufacturing is the way to go, then maybe that mayor is going to invest in education. So knowing about the identity of elites over time will be like fantastic. We haven't been able to do it, but it is something that's in the to-do list. If the data is there, I think you're absolutely right that will be crucial in terms of like kind of closing the story, understanding well the story.
Okay, thanks, Claudio. If there are no other questions, I would like to thank the participants for taking part, and Claudio and Pedro for being here with us. Just before we disappear, next month we have Nathan Nunn from Harvard. So always please keep an eye on our website for more activities. So I'm stopping recording.